The morning sun peeked through the blinds as Vivian's alarm blared its familiar tone. Another day, another flight. At 42, she had grown accustomed to the rhythm of travel that came with being one of the top aerospace engineers at Horizon Dynamics. Today's destination, San Diego, for the annual Defense Innovation Conference where she would present her latest work on avionics systems. Vivian moved through her apartment with practiced efficiency, packing her carry-on with the essentials, her tablet loaded with presentation files, a small notebook with handwritten notes, and her beloved set of specialized technical markers. These weren't your typical office supplies. They were her secret weapon, allowing her to annotate complex diagrams with precision that digital tools simply couldn't match. "Don't forget your lunch this time," she reminded herself aloud, placing a sandwich into her bag. Airport food was always overpriced and underwhelming. The taxi ride to Boston Logan International Airport was uneventful, the driver chatting about the unseasonably warm October weather, while Vivian's mind wandered to her upcoming presentation. She had spent months refining her ideas on improving navigation systems for both commercial and military aircraft. The work wasn't flashy, but it was important, the kind that prevented problems rather than solving them after disasters occurred. At the airport, Vivian navigated security with the ease of someone who had done it hundreds of times. Shoes off, laptop out, liquids in a clear bag. She made small talk with the TSA agent, who commented on her collection of colorful markers. "My kids would love those," the agent said with a smile. "They're special technical markers," Vivian explained. "They write on almost any surface and don't bleed through paper. Fancy. Have a good flight." Gate 34B was crowded with the usual mix of business travelers and vacationers. Vivian found a seat near the window, watching as ground crew prepared the aircraft that would carry them across the country. The boarding announcement came over the speakers, and she joined the line of passengers shuffling toward the jet bridge. "Seat 12F, the gate agent confirmed, scanning her boarding pass. "Down the aisle and to your right." The Boeing 737 was nearly full when Vivian reached her assigned window seat. A middle-aged man with a newspaper occupied the aisle seat, nodding politely as she stepped past him. The middle seat mercifully remained empty as the boarding process concluded. "Looks like we lucked out," the man commented, gesturing to the empty space between them. "Always a nice surprise," Vivian agreed, settling into her seat and stowing her bag beneath the seat in front. She had long ago given up hoping for empty seats on cross-country flights. This small luxury would make the 6-hour journey more comfortable. The flight attendants moved through their safety demonstration while the plane taxied to the runway. Vivian watched with half attention, having memorized the routine years ago. The aircraft gained speed, pressed her gently back into her seat, and lifted into the clear blue sky above Boston. The city shrank beneath them, the harbor sparkling in the morning light before disappearing into the distance. Once the seatbelt sign turned off, Vivian retrieved her tablet and the case containing her markers. The man beside her had already buried himself in his newspaper, creating an invisible wall of privacy between them. Perfect. She could work without distraction. The tablet screen displayed the complex schematic she had been refining for weeks, a detailed map of electrical, routing systems used in modern aircraft. Her presentation would focus on potential improvements to these designs, suggesting modifications that could enhance both safety and efficiency. Using a blue marker, she began adding notes in the margins of the digital drawing, the specialized tip leaving precise lines on the screen. A flight attendant paused beside their row. "Offering drinks, just water please," Vivian requested. The attendant's eyes lingered on the colorful diagram. "That looks complicated." "It's for a conference presentation," Vivian explained simply, accepting the plastic cup. She had learned long ago that detailed explanations of her work often led to glazed eyes or worse, uncomfortable questions about military applications. "Must be important," the attendant commented before moving on. Important but underappreciated, Vivian thought. Few passengers on this plane would ever consider the complex systems enabling their journey, the countless engineers who had designed and refined every component. She took pride in her work, even if it rarely earned recognition outside of specialist circles. 2 hours into the flight, Vivian had filled the margins of her schematic with notes and questions. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as lunch service began. She accepted a sandwich and continued working. switching to a red marker to highlight potential problem areas in the current designs. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, causing drinks to slosh and passengers to look up nervously. Vivian's hand jerked, sending her marker rolling down the tray table and onto the floor. She unbuckled her seatbelt and bent down to retrieve it, squinting in the dim cabin light. The marker had rolled beneath the seat in front of her, forcing Vivian to reach awkwardly into the narrow space. Her fingers brushed against something metallic, not her marker, but a floor panel that seemed slightly out of alignment with its neighbors. An ordinary passenger would never notice, but to Vivian's trained eye, it was immediately apparent. She located her marker and sat up, but her mind remained fixed on what she had seen. After years of studying aircraft design, small anomalies stood out like glaring errors. This particular panel configuration didn't match the standard layout she was familiar with. Curious, she bent down again, this time with her phone's flashlight. The beam illuminated the area where the floor panel met the seat track. There was a slight gap, barely half a centimeter, but enough to reveal the wiring bundle beneath. Something about the routing looked odd to her, different from the specifications she had reviewed countless times. "Everything okay?" her roommate asked, noticing her unusual position. "Just dropped my marker," Vivian replied casually, straightening up. She didn't want to cause concern by sharing her observations. After all, it could be nothing. Perhaps a minor variation specific to this aircraft model. But as the flight continued, she couldn't shake the image from her mind. Pulling up reference materials on her tablet, she began cross-checking standard designs against what she had glimpsed. The more she compared, the more certain she became that something was amiss. Not necessarily dangerous, but definitely not aligned with optimal design practices. She started a fresh page in her notebook, sketching what she had observed and adding technical notes with her markers. If her suspicions were correct, this variation could potentially affect electrical system redundancy, a critical safety feature in all aircraft. More concerning, similar design elements were used in military planes, including the advanced F-22 Raptor fighter jets. Vivian took a sip of water, contemplating her next steps. Should she mention something to the flight crew? Would they even understand the significance? Commercial pilots were skilled professionals, but few had deep knowledge of electrical engineering specifics. By the time the captain announced their initial descent into San Diego, Vivian had filled 3 pages with observations and potential implications. What had begun as routine preparation for a conference had unexpectedly transformed into something potentially significant. As the California coastline came into view, Vivian carefully packed away her materials, her mind still racing with possibilities. She would need to verify her findings, perhaps speak with colleagues at the conference. If her concerns proved valid, the appropriate authorities would need to be notified. The wheels touched down on the runway with a gentle bump. Passengers around her began collecting their belongings, eager to depart after the long flight. But Vivian remained lost in thought, her hand resting on the notebook that now contained observations that might prove crucial. She had boarded as just another passenger in seat 12F. She would disembark with something much more important. A discovery that might ultimately reach the highest levels of military aviation and change established protocols, all because a marker had rolled beneath a seat, and because she had the expertise to recognize what others would never see. Little did she know that her routine flight was just the beginning of a journey that would eventually make F-22 pilots stand at attention. Vivian stepped into the bustling terminal of San Diego International Airport, her mind still buzzing with the discovery she'd made on the flight. The warm California air hit her as she exited the building and hailed a taxi to her hotel. Throughout the 20-minute ride, she kept opening her notebook, staring at her sketches and then closing it again. "First time in San Diego?" the driver asked, noticing her distraction. "No," she replied. "I come every year for a conference. Just have a lot on my mind today." The driver nodded, understanding the preoccupation of business travelers. "Well, enjoy your stay. Weather's perfect this week." Vivian barely registered the comment. The hotel check-in was a blur, and within an hour she was sitting cross-legged on the bed in her room, her notes spread around her. Her laptop opened to technical specifications of commercial aircraft electrical systems. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered, comparing her sketches to the standard diagrams. The routing she had observed under the floor panel shouldn't exist on a commercial aircraft. Lieutenant Colonel Chen's office answered a crisp voice. This is Vivian Torres from Horizon Dynamics. I worked with the Colonel on the Joint Civilian-Military Navigation Project 3 years ago, she explained. I need to speak with him urgently about a potential safety issue that may affect both commercial and military aircraft, including the F-22. There was a pause. Hold, please. Moments later, a familiar male voice came on the line. Vivian, it's been a while. What's this about the F-22 program? Tom, I found something on a commercial flight yesterday that doesn't add up, she said, keeping her explanation concise and technical. I believe there may be a wiring configuration issue that could affect navigation systems under specific conditions. The same subcontractor works on components for the Raptor program. The line was silent for a moment. How confident are you in this assessment? Confident enough that I'm missing my own conference presentation to call you, Vivian replied. I see, he said, his tone shifting to something more formal. I'll need to see your documentation. Are you still in San Diego? Yes, at the Pacific Grand Hotel. Stay there. Someone will contact you within the hour. True to his word, 45 minutes later, Vivian's phone rang with instructions to meet at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the hotel. She gathered her notes, her precious markers, and headed out, wondering if she was overreacting or if her chance discovery in seat 12F was about to become much bigger than she ever imagined. The coffee shop was busy with the midday rush when Vivian arrived. She ordered a latte and found a table near the back, her notebook and tablet at the ready. She wasn't entirely sure who she was meeting or what to expect. 10 minutes later, a woman in civilian clothes approached her table. She was in her 40s with short dark hair and an air of quiet authority that suggested military background. Ms. Torres? The woman asked, her voice low. Vivian nodded. I'm Grace Winters. Lieutenant Colonel Chen sent me. Mind if I join you? Vivian gestured to the empty chair across from her. Please. Grace sat down, placed a small device on the table that looked like a phone but wasn't, and pressed something on its screen. A faint hum emerged. Anti-surveillance measure, she explained simply. Now we can talk freely. Vivian raised her eyebrows but didn't comment. Instead, she opened her notebook. I should start by saying I'm not completely certain about this. It could be nothing. Let's assume it's something and go from there, Grace replied. Show me what you found. For the next 15 minutes, Vivian walked Grace through her discovery. The unusual wiring configuration she'd spotted beneath seat 12F, her subsequent research, and the information Priya had shared about the parts shortage and temporary fix. Grace listened intently, occasionally asking sharp technical questions that revealed her own engineering background. When Vivian finished, Grace sat back and studied her thoughtfully. Your reputation precedes you, Ms. Torres. Tom said you were thorough, but this... She gestured at the detailed diagrams Vivian had created with her markers. This is impressive work based on a glimpse under a floor panel. I've been designing and reviewing these systems for 20 years, Vivian said with a shrug. After a while, you develop an eye for when something's off. Grace nodded. And your concern is that under certain conditions, electromagnetic interference, power surges, or possibly even targeted electronic warfare, this configuration could create a navigation vulnerability? Exactly. In commercial aircraft, those conditions are rare, though not impossible. But in a combat situation, our pilots could be flying with compromised systems, Grace finished for her, and they wouldn't know until it was too late. She tapped her fingers on the table, thinking. We need to verify this immediately. She picked up the security device and made a call. It's Winters. I need a team at Miramar, full avionics inspection on one of our birds. Priority Alpha. She listened for a moment. Yes, I'll bring her. She's the one who spotted it. Another pause. Understood. We'll be there in 30. Grace ended the call and looked at Vivian. How do you feel about visiting a military base today? Vivian blinked. I'm supposed to be at the conference. Your country needs you more than that conference does right now, Grace said, her tone gentle but firm. If you're right about this, and I suspect you are, we need to confirm it and implement a fix immediately. The gravity of the situation sank in. Vivian nodded. Let me grab my things from the hotel. I'll meet you out front in 10 minutes. 20 minutes later, they were driving through the gates of Marine Corps Air Station Miramar, home to several fighter squadrons. Vivian's visitor badge hung around her neck. hastily issued after a flurry of calls from Grace's superiors. The hangar they entered was massive, its size emphasized by the sleek gray F-22 Raptor positioned in the center. A team of uniformed personnel was already gathered, along with several civilians in polo shirts who Vivian guessed were contractor engineers. A tall man with silver hair broke away from the group and approached them. The name Colonel Richards was embroidered on his flight suit. Lieutenant Colonel Winters, he acknowledged with a nod before turning to Vivian. And you must be Ms. Torres. I understand we have you to thank for flagging a potential issue with our aircraft. Potentially, Vivian emphasized. I'm still not certain. Well, we're about to find out. He gestured toward the F-22. We've pulled this aircraft for immediate inspection based on your findings. It was serviced during the time frame you identified with components from the supplier in question. Vivian felt a flutter of nerves. What if she was wrong? What if she'd caused all this trouble over nothing? A young woman in a flight suit approached. We're ready to begin the inspection, sir. Captain Harlow will be leading the technical team, the colonel explained to Vivian. She's our top avionics specialist. Captain Harlow smiled at Vivian. I've read your paper on integrated navigation systems, Ms. Torres. Your work on redundancy protocols is part of our training now. Vivian hadn't expected that. Thank you. Would you mind walking us through exactly what we're looking for? Captain Harlow asked, leading them toward a section of the aircraft where panels had been removed, exposing the complex maze of systems within. For the next hour, Vivian worked alongside the military technical team, showing them what to look for, explaining the subtle differences between standard configurations and the workaround she'd spotted on her commercial flight. Her colorful markers came out again, as she sketched directly onto transparent overlays placed on technical diagrams. The atmosphere in the hangar grew increasingly tense as the inspection progressed. What had started with some skepticism, particularly from older engineers who didn't appreciate a civilian woman pointing out what they might have missed, gradually shifted to concern as evidence mounted. Found it, called one of the technicians, his voice echoing in the hangar. Portside navigation subsystem, exactly where Ms. Torres predicted. The group gathered around as he pointed out the wiring bundle that matched Vivian's description. Captain Harlow looked from the exposed system to Vivian's diagram and back again. It's identical, she confirmed, her expression grim. The redundant routing has been bypassed just as you described. Colonel Richards's face had grown increasingly serious throughout the inspection. Now he turned to Grace. How many aircraft could be affected? We're still determining that, sir, she replied. But potentially all Raptors serviced at 3 different facilities during the part shortage. He cursed under his breath, then composed himself. Apologies, Ms. Torres, you understand the implications? Vivian nodded. She understood all too well. In a combat situation, especially against an adversary with advanced electronic warfare capabilities, this vulnerability could be catastrophic. Fighter pilots relied absolutely on their navigation systems. Any compromise could mean mission failure, or worse. Sir, Captain Harlow interjected. Ms. Torres's diagrams also suggest a potential fix that wouldn't require complete replacement of the affected components. The colonel raised his eyebrows. Is that right? Vivian stepped forward hesitantly. It's just a theory, but yes. If you reroute these connections here and here, she pointed to her diagram, and add a simple bypass circuit, you could restore the redundancy without a major overhaul. The group of engineers studied her proposed solution, murmuring among themselves. Finally, one of the senior contractors nodded. It's elegant, minimally invasive. We could implement this in days rather than weeks. Colonel Richards looked at Vivian with new respect. Ms. Torres, it seems we're in your debt twice over. Not only did you identify a critical vulnerability, but you've handed us the solution as well. A commotion at the hangar entrance drew their attention. A group of pilots in flight suits was walking in, apparently just returned from a mission. They approached with curious expressions, clearly wondering why their aircraft was being inspected. The colonel turned to them. Gentlemen, perfect timing. I'd like you to meet someone. The pilots gathered around as Colonel Richards explained. In simplified terms, what Vivian had discovered and what it meant for their aircraft. The lead pilot, whose name tag read Lawson, stepped forward and extended his hand to Vivian. Ma'am, I don't fully understand the technical details, but I gather you just saved our lives. That might be an exaggeration, Vivian said, uncomfortable with the attention. With all due respect, he replied, it's not. We fly these birds at the edge of their capabilities, trusting that every system will work exactly as designed. What you found? He shook his head. Well, let's just say we owe you a debt we can't repay. One by one, the other pilots came forward to shake her hand. The last one asked, how did you even spot this? Our own engineers missed it. Vivian smiled slightly. I was just a passenger in seat 12F who dropped her marker at the right moment. The rest was just doing my job. But as she looked around at the faces of these elite pilots, men and women who risked their lives in the most advanced fighter jets in the world, Vivian knew it was more than that. Her attention to detail, her years of experience, and her willingness to speak up had made all the difference. A civilian with a handful of colored markers had just changed the course of military aviation safety. And this was only the beginning. The next 48 hours passed in a blur for Vivian. The conference she'd come to San Diego for was forgotten as she found herself working around the clock in a secured room at Miramar, surrounded by military engineers and contractors. Her hotel room went unused while she caught brief naps on a cot in a side office, unwilling to leave until they had a solid plan in place. You need real sleep, Grace told her on the evening of the second day, placing a cup of coffee beside Vivian's latest set of diagrams. We can manage without you for 8 hours. Vivian rubbed her eyes, which were burning from fatigue. Her fingers were stained with ink from her markers, which had become something of a legend among the team. They'd even started calling her Marker Lady, a nickname she found both amusing and oddly touching. I'll sleep when we have the bypass circuit finalized, she replied, taking a grateful sip of coffee. We're close. Across the table, Captain Harlow was testing the prototype circuit board they'd fabricated based on Vivian's design. The young officer had proven to be brilliant, quickly grasping Vivian's concepts and adding valuable refinements. Try moving the ground connection, Vivian suggested, pointing with her blue marker. If we route it here instead, it should reduce interference. Captain Harlow made the adjustment and ran another simulation. Her face broke into a smile as the results appeared on her laptop screen. That's it! Clean signal, even under simulated jamming conditions. The room erupted in tired cheers. They'd been working on this solution non-stop, aware that every day that passed meant more aircraft and potentially more lives at risk. Colonel Richards entered just as they were celebrating. I take it we have good news? Captain Harlow nodded. The bypass circuit works, sir. We can implement it without major disassembly of the affected systems. Excellent. He turned to Vivian. Washington is very interested in your discovery, Ms. Torres. The Secretary of Defense has been briefed. Vivian felt her stomach tighten. This had escalated far beyond anything she'd expected when she'd spotted that misaligned floor panel. There's more, the colonel continued. We've confirmed that 14 Air Force bases have affected aircraft, along with 3 Navy installations. And the commercial implications, he shook his head. The FAA is conducting emergency inspections of the entire domestic fleet. The scope was staggering. What had started as one engineer's observation had ballooned into a nationwide aviation safety operation. The fix is relatively simple, Vivian said, focusing on solutions rather than problems. Once you know what to look for, the bypass can be installed in less than 4 hours per aircraft, which is why we're implementing it immediately, Colonel Richards confirmed. Teams are being briefed at every affected base as we speak using your documentation. He handed her a folder. These are your new security clearance papers. Temporary, but they'll allow you to continue consulting on this project. Vivian took the folder surprised. What about my job? My company? Grace, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. Your CEO has been informed that you're assisting with a matter of national security. The details are classified, but he's been assured you'll return when the work is complete. And he was okay with that? Vivian asked skeptically. Grace smiled slightly. Let's just say government contracts can be very persuasive. The next morning, after finally getting a full night's sleep at a nearby military guest lodge, Vivian returned to find the hangar transformed into an operations center. Large screens displayed maps showing military bases across the country, with colored indicators tracking the progress of inspections and repairs. In one corner, a group of pilots was receiving a briefing from Captain Harlow, who was explaining the technical aspects of the vulnerability and how it might affect their aircraft performance. They listened with intense concentration, occasionally asking questions that revealed their deep understanding of their machines. Colonel Richards spotted Vivian and waved her over. Perfect timing. There's someone who wants to speak with you. He led her to a secure video conference room where several high-ranking officers were already gathered. On the large screen was the stern face of a 4-star general at the Pentagon. General Thompson, this is Vivian Torres, the engineer who identified the issue. Colonel Richards introduced her. The general's expression softened slightly. Ms. Torres, your country owes you a debt of gratitude. Your attention to detail and willingness to speak up may have prevented a catastrophic failure during combat operations. I was just doing my job. Sir, Vivian replied, uncomfortable with the praise. A job you did exceptionally well, the general countered. We've completed inspections on 30% of the potentially affected aircraft, and every single one shows the vulnerability you identified. Without your intervention, this could have gone undetected until it was too late. He leaned closer to the camera. I understand you've developed a fix as well? It was a team effort, sir, Vivian said, glancing at Captain Harlow, who had just entered the room. Captain Harlow and the engineering team here at Miramar were instrumental in refining the solution. The general nodded approvingly at her sharing of credit. Nevertheless, your initial design was what made this rapid response possible. The President has been briefed on the situation, and he's authorized me to offer you a position as a special consultant to the Department of Defense, overseeing the implementation of your fix across all affected platforms, both military and civilian. Vivian was stunned. I don't know what to say, sir. Say yes, Colonel Richards murmured beside her. We need you. The next few weeks were the most intense of Vivian's professional life. She traveled from base to base, overseeing the repair teams, troubleshooting unexpected issues, and refining the bypass circuit as they gained more experience with different aircraft configurations. At each base, she was treated with a mix of curiosity and respect. Word had spread about the civilian lady with the markers, who had spotted what countless military inspections had missed. Pilots would seek her out to thank her personally, sometimes bringing their families to meet her. My husband would still be flying a compromised aircraft if not for you, one pilot's wife told Vivian, gripping her hand tightly. I can't thank you enough. These moments touched Vivian deeply, but what really moved her were the quiet conversations with the maintenance crews, the men and women who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to keep the aircraft flying safely. They respected her because she spoke their language and understood their challenges. Most consultants waltz in, tell us what we're doing wrong, and leave. An older crew chief told her at Andrews Air Force Base. You get your hands dirty. You listen. That means something to us. By the 6-week mark, nearly all affected military aircraft had been repaired, and the commercial fleet was making rapid progress as well. Vivian found herself in Washington, D.C., for a final briefing at the Pentagon before her consultant role would end and she would return to her regular job, though she suspected nothing would feel regular. Again, the briefing room was packed with high-ranking officers and civilian officials when Vivian entered with Grace, who had become both her handler and friend during this whirlwind period. As Vivian walked to the podium to present her final report, something unprecedented happened. Every uniformed person in the room, including generals with decades of service, stood up. It wasn't the required standing for a superior officer. It was something else entirely, a spontaneous show of respect from warriors to someone who had safeguarded their lives. For a moment, Vivian froze, overwhelmed by the gesture. Then Grace gently nudged her forward. They're standing for you, she whispered. The marker lady from seat 12F who made the F-22 pilot stand at attention. Vivian took a deep breath and stepped up to the podium, facing the room full of military leaders who were now waiting for her to speak. She opened her briefing folder, and tucked inside was the blue marker that had started it all, the one that had rolled under the seat on that routine flight and led to this extraordinary moment. She placed it carefully beside her notes and began to speak. 6 months had passed since that life-changing flight in seat 12F. Vivian stood on the tarmac at Edwards Air Force Base in California, the desert wind whipping at her hair as she watched F-22 Raptors perform a series of breathtaking maneuvers against the clear blue sky. Each aircraft now carried the modified wiring system that she had helped design, a small change invisible to the naked eye, but one that could mean the difference between life and death in combat conditions. "Impressive, aren't they?" asked Colonel Richards, who stood beside her wearing sunglasses against the bright sun. He had become a friend during the months they'd worked together implementing the fix across the Air Force fleet. "They've always been impressive," Vivian replied with a smile. "But now I can enjoy the show without worrying about their navigation systems failing." The colonel chuckled. "The pilots feel the same way. Knowing every possible vulnerability has been addressed gives them confidence up there." They fell silent as the lead F-22 performed a near-vertical climb followed by a complex rolling maneuver that showcased the aircraft's remarkable agility. Vivian felt a swell of pride, not just in her contribution, but in the entire team that had worked tirelessly to resolve the issue. After the demonstration, they walked toward a hangar where a small gathering was taking place. Today marked the official completion of the military phase of the retrofit program. All affected aircraft in the U.S. Armed Forces had been repaired, and the commercial aviation industry was well on its way to implementing the same fix. "Nervous about your speech?" the colonel asked as they approached the hangar. Vivian adjusted the collar of her blazer. "A little. I'm more comfortable with wiring diagrams than with public speaking. Just be yourself. These people already respect you. You don't need to impress them." Inside the hangar, about 50 people were gathered, a mix of military personnel, government officials, and engineers who had been involved in the project. At the front of the room stood a small podium with the Air Force insignia. Beside it was a covered object on a stand. General Thompson, whom Vivian had met several times since that first video conference, approached her with an outstretched hand. "Ms. Torres, good to see you again. We're almost ready to begin." Vivian nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of the moment. What had started as a chance observation had grown into something that affected national security, commercial aviation safety, and the lives of countless pilots and passengers. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. General Thompson spoke about the importance of attention to detail and the courage to speak up when something doesn't look right. He praised the collaboration between civilian and military experts that had made the rapid response possible. "And now," he said, turning toward Vivian, "it's my pleasure to introduce the woman who started it all, Ms. Vivian Torres." The applause was warm as Vivian stepped up to the podium. She looked out at the faces before her, pilots whose lives had been at risk, engineers who had worked alongside her to develop the solution, officials who had coordinated the massive effort. "Thank you, General," she began, her voice steady despite her nerves. 6 months ago, I was just a passenger in seat 12F on a routine flight to San Diego. I dropped my marker, bent down to retrieve it, and noticed something that didn't look quite right. That small moment changed everything. She spoke for about 10 minutes, explaining in simple terms what she had discovered and how the collaborative effort had turned her initial observation into a comprehensive solution. She acknowledged every group that had contributed, from the maintenance crews who had worked around the clock to the administrators who had cut through red tape to expedite the process. In engineering, we often talk about redundancy, backup systems that activate when primary systems fail, she concluded. But the most important redundancy in any organization is human, having multiple sets of eyes looking at the same problem from different perspectives. That's what made this effort successful. Not just my observation, but the thousands of dedicated professionals who took it seriously and worked together to make things right. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. General Thompson returned to the podium and gestured toward the covered object. "Ms. Torres, in recognition of your exceptional service to the United States Armed Forces and to aviation safety worldwide, we have a small token of our appreciation." He removed the cloth to reveal a glass case containing a precisely detailed scale model of an F-22 Raptor. Mounted beside it was a blue marker identical to the one Vivian had dropped on the plane, but this one had been cast in silver and engraved with her name and the date of her discovery. "This will be displayed at the Air Force Academy," the general explained, "where it will remind future officers and engineers that sometimes the most critical observations come from unexpected sources." Vivian was speechless, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. She had expected perhaps a certificate or a letter of thanks, not something that would inspire future generations. After the ceremony, a group of pilots approached her. She recognized Captain Lawson, who had been one of the first to thank her months ago at Miramar. "We wanted to give you something too," he said, handing her a small box. "It's from all of us who fly the Raptor." Inside was a patch, the kind pilots wore on their flight suits, showing the silhouette of an F-22 with a blue marker crossing behind it. At the bottom were the words, "12th always vigilant." "You don't have to say anything," replied a female pilot standing nearby. "Just know that you've become part of our story now. We don't forget our own." Later that evening, Vivian sat alone on the patio of her hotel room, watching the sunset paint the desert landscape in shades of orange and gold. She held the pilot's patch in one hand and one of her well-used markers in the other. Her phone buzzed with a message from her boss back at Horizon Dynamics. "Board approved your new department. Aviation safety and system integration is officially yours to build. Budget and headcount details to follow. Congratulations, Director Torres," she smiled. After her work with the military had made headlines, though the specific details remained classified, her company had been eager to capitalize on her newfound reputation. Rather than seeking personal gain, Vivian had proposed creating a new division focused on identifying and addressing potential vulnerabilities in aviation systems before they became problems. Another message came through, this one from Priya at the FAA. "Final commercial fleet inspection numbers just came in. 89% complete, all showing successful implementation of the Torres bypass. Remaining aircraft scheduled for completion by month's end. You've changed the industry, friend." Vivian took a deep breath of the cool evening air. When she'd boarded that flight 6 months ago, she'd been just another passenger in seat 12F, heading to a conference to deliver a presentation that few would remember. Now she had the opportunity to make a lasting difference in aviation safety. She thought about all the people she'd met on this journey, the pilots who trusted their lives to the systems she helped design, the engineers who worked alongside her to find solutions, the officials who had removed barriers instead of creating them. The blue marker in her hand had become something of a talisman to her now. Such a simple tool, yet it had led to such extraordinary outcomes. As the last light faded from the sky, Vivian made a silent promise to herself. She would never stop paying attention to the details, never stop speaking up when something didn't look right, never forget that sometimes the smallest observations could have the biggest impact. After all, she wasn't just the woman from seat 12F anymore. She was the marker lady who made the F-22 pilot stand at attention, and she had a responsibility to live up to that legacy.